In this next chapter, we're going to explore different methods for customizing your work environment. That could be your user interface, workspaces, even palettes and toolbars and menus. We're going to start off in this lesson by talking about workspaces. This whole time, if you've been following along, you've been working with me in the default CorelDRAW X4 workspace. That means things like menu bars and toolbars showing up where they do, the property bar. I've got a toolbox docked on the left and a color palette docked over here on the right-hand side of my screen. I've got a status bar at the bottom, rulers showing up, all part of my workspace. Well, what happens if you've been using a different application and you're migrating over to CorelDRAW? This whole work environment could be foreign to you, and it might take you a while to get up and running. That is, unless you want to change your workspace to resemble what you came from. For example, there's a built-in workspace that we can access for Adobe Illustrator users. It'll create a more familiar work environment, lessening the learning curve and getting you up to speed sooner and faster. You can create your own as well. This is all stuff we're going to do in this lesson. Then in the next lesson, we're going to move on to customizing the actual menus and the toolbars, so the buttons you see on those toolbars, for example. And the very last thing we'll do in this chapter is customize the actual color palettes that you use. So they can be customized to give you the colors readily available to you at your fingertips that you use most often, for example. But right now we're going to start with a brand new file here. You can click the new button. Really doesn't matter what's on your screen as far as the actual page. What we're going to focus in on is everything around it. This is our workspace, the default CorelDRAW X4 workspace. Now let's go up to the Tools menu and down to Options and select Workspace over here at the top. So long as it's selected, you'll see some options over here on the right. First of all, you'll see a check mark next to the X4 default workspace. That's what we're working in. Now remember I mentioned that scenario where an Adobe Illustrator user who's accustomed to their work environment maybe migrates to CorelDRAW or is asked to use CorelDRAW for a project. Well, when we click on the checkbox next to Adobe Illustrator here, watch what happens in the background. Things will change. First of all, the toolbox over here is now floating. This is more like Adobe Illustrator. The Object Manager opens up by default. That's something you're used to seeing in Adobe Illustrator. At the top, the menu headings have changed slightly. You may have noticed that. We've got fewer of them. There's no standard toolbar up there, but we do see our context-sensitive property bar. And that's because I've selected a different workspace based on Adobe Illustrator. Now when I switch back to X4, watch the menus, the toolbars, the toolboxes, etc. It's all changed back to what I'm used to working in here in CorelDRAW. Look over here though, we've also got some options to create our own workspaces to suit our needs. The new button, we're going to do that momentarily. We've also got the ability to import and export workspaces. Let's say you've got 3 computers. You don't want to have to set up the same workspace on all 3 of them. You set it up once and you export it to yourself. So it could be to a disk, a network drive. You could even email it to yourself if you wanted to. We'll explore that momentarily. Importing allows you to bring in those exported workspaces. So we'll do that too. Right now though, we're going to create a brand new workspace. We've got our 2 defaults that are available to us here. But when we click New, we get to give our workspace a name. I'm going to call this Dave's WS for workspace. I'm going to add some information in the description. You can see here the description for my X4 default workspace is default workspace. Here I'm just going to say things like floating toolbox and palettes. And when I click OK, notice Set as Current Workspace is already selected here. So when I click OK, I'll be using this brand new workspace. So I click OK. It's now added, has the check mark, so I can click OK. And when I do that, I can come in here and start making changes. So the toolbox, when I move to the top to touch those little dots, I see the 4-sided arrow. I'm going to click and drag that in here and just move it into the corner. So it's now a floating toolbox. I'm going to grab my color palettes as well over here on the right, drag that down so it's floating. Maybe size it, change the width and the length if I wanted to. I don't really want to have to scroll, so I'm going to go right down to there so I can see all of the colors. Maybe this is an example of a work environment I like to work in. So now when I go back to Tools and down to Options, with Workspace still selected and my new one checked off, this is my new workspace. If I wanted to be able to select any of these 3 workspaces every time I launch CorelDRAW, then I would click this checkbox down here to select the workspace at startup. I'm not going to select that. I don't really want that. But now I know how to create a new workspace. If I want to go back to my default workspace, it's just clicking the checkbox. Everything goes back into place. There's my Adobe one. Things shift around. And there's my new one. When you're done with a workspace, you can always click on it, make sure it's selected, and click your delete button. When I delete a workspace, you can see it just goes back to my default here, and my new one is gone. Easy as that. Now let's talk about importing and exporting. I'm going to go to the export button. When I click export, I've got the ability to export a workspace according to selections I make here in these checkboxes. So I do want Dockers. If I click the plus sign next to menus, I want just the menu bar. If I wanted the context menu bar, I could do that too. Let's see what that looks like. Shortcut keys and status bar, well, just the status bar. Let's go to toolbars now and only choose the ones that we want. Standard, property bar, and let's say we do a lot of work with text. So we want the text one as well, and the toolbox, of course. So with those selected, notice that because I chose export, I have the option now to save this to a location, or if I want, email it. When I click email, I get my default email application launched and a new email message already created for me with the workspace attached. So I'm going to go right up here to save, and I'm going to save this to my desktop. Let's go to the desktop here. Down below, the file name you can see is going to have an extension .xslt, but I can type right over that. I'm going to type my custom WS and click save. There, it's done. All I have to do is click close. If I wanted to email it as well, I could, but I'm going to click close. And now to import, we can go to the import button. Now when we import, we have to browse for that file. When I click the browse button, you can see it right here on my desktop, my custom workspace. So when I click on that and click open, all I have to do is click next now to move through. Select items to import. These are all the things I selected a moment ago. I want them all. I click next. Into the current workspace or create a new workspace. I'd like to see a new workspace made out of this one. Here I get to give it a name. I'm going to type in the same thing, my custom WS. I'm going to skip the optional description and just click next. So there it is. There's the name. There's the items included. Just a last check. If I like what I see, I click finish. Takes a moment and there's my custom workspace right there. So only the items I selected will appear. I'm going to delete that because I've created another one or exported another one for you. Let's go to our import button now and let's browse to the lesson 14 folder of the exercise files. So I'm going to go right to my lesson 14 folder. There's a custom workspace 1. Give that a click, click open, and now I go through the same questions, the same steps. You can see all of the different items that were selected. Click next. I'd like to create a new workspace from that. I'm going to call this WS2, the second one. Click next. There's a refresh or a review of everything that's about to happen. When I click finish, I create a brand new workspace based on those selections, and I click OK to use this new workspace. So that's all there is to creating your own workspaces, using existing workspaces, and importing and exporting. One last thing before we're done, back to tools and options. I'm going to delete that workspace, make sure I've switched back to my default, and click OK. So there we go. You can always have the workspace you need to make you feel comfortable in your environment. You can create as many workspaces as you want, switch between them on the fly, and of course, if you're going to be using a workspace on multiple machines, you can export them, even email them to yourself to make it easy for you to import them on those machines. All right, next we're going to focus in on the actual menus and the toolbars themselves and the buttons that appear there and see how we can customize those to make it a little bit more comfortable for you in your work environment.